attending, especially our guests who are located outside the United States. We know you have to struggle as far as time zones and when, so we appreciate the effort that you put in. We would ask that if you have questions, and we encourage questions, go ahead and put them into the chat box, and we'll address them at the conclusion of the presentation. Depending upon how big the crowd is, we may just have you unmute and develop the discussion that way. I want to remind everybody that the program is being recorded and will be archived on the I-29 website. We'd like to welcome our presenter today, Dr. Brad Heins, Professor of Organic Dairy Management at the University of Minnesota's West Central Research Center in Morris, Minnesota. Currently, Dr. Heins conducts his research in the center's 130 head certified organic cows, plus the 160 head of cows in conventional dairy grazing systems. His research and extension program focuses on best management practices for production, crossbreeding of dairy cattle, group rearing of calves, and renewable energy for dairy production systems. He also serves on the Minnesota Institute for Sustainable Agriculture Board of Directors and the Minnesota Organic Advisory Task Force. Sprouting grain for livestock feed has gained renewed interest as a method to produce a continuous supply of fresh, high-quality forage. Today, Dr. Heins will discuss the feasibility, efficiency, and challenges of implementing sprouted grain systems on the dairy farm. As I always say, Dr. Heins, the podium is yours.
Thanks, Fred. I appreciate the invitation to speak today. And, you know, it's a topic that I have done research with quite a few years ago, actually. And it seems to come up a lot when farmers experience adverse weather events, whether it's drought or a lot of rain, and people start thinking about fodder production. And that's really what got me interested as well. And we did some research with fodder here, and I'll show you those. We'll kind of give you a background about it, some of the research studies that we did here, and maybe a little bit about economics and some thoughts about fodder production. But really, it was Kathy Soder and I. Kathy's at the USDA in Pennsylvania, and her and I did some research together and have a research paper on fodder production systems as well. So credit to Kathy for doing some stuff in the Northeast as well. So there's, you know, fodder is certainly not new. It really got its interest in Australia, New Zealand, long before in the United States here. But really there's, you know, a lot of interest in the US again, with droughts. You talk about high grain prices. That always gets people thinking about fodder production. It's viewed as an easy way to produce high quality forage. That's the view. Maybe not. I think after you get into it, you'll realize that it's maybe not an easy way to produce high quality forage. And sometimes, you know, the marketing of these systems is, you know, there's a big marketing machine and has some pretty impressive claims and animal production studies, things like that, on them as well. And but we're going to look at, you know, is fodder feasible and economical for U.S. dairy farms? There's lots of sort of perceived benefits. You get increased maybe palatability. Obviously, it's really highly digestible forage, so the cows, they do like it, they eat it. I think there's a perception that it's kind of a feel-good feed. You know, it's nice and green, it's fresh. We're giving the cows what they want. You know, you see the cows eat it, so it kind of makes us feel good. You can get lots of forage in a small space, and I'll show you our forage production facility that we used. You know, it's just inside of a barn. Most people put these in different spots. There's maybe little waste, low energy consumption. It doesn't take a lot of energy unless you have lots of grow lights. Water consumption is a different story. It depends on the size of your system, whether you have low or high water consumption. You get forage really fast, and it might be perceived as high quality and easy to grow. But we've seen some, benefits as well. Increased nutritional quality. It increases digestibility. We've seen some improvement in fatty acids, nutrient availability. It is fresh forage, so the nutrients are available right away when you get this high quality forage. There may be some other properties here that I've listed that may or may not be substantiated with the research. You can get consistent feed quality if you can certainly minimize changes. If you have your fodder production system and dialed up right away, you have the same temperature, the same humidity, the schedule for watering, the same feeding schedule. You can grow consistent feed. Most people grow them inside, so you are less reliant on the weather. But mold is always a consideration, and I'll show you some slides on some of what it might look like. Mold is probably the biggest threat to the fodder production system that I've seen out there. And it really depends on the output, how much fodder can you produce? And that's always a certain question. There's been some, perceptions about animal performance. There a lot of these are certain claims, whether you get more milk production, improved digestion, immune response, lower somatic cell count, those type of things. We looked at a lot of those from our research, and I'll show you those. But these are some of the claims that are being made based on fodder production, or some farmers that have used it in their system. What they see, you can maybe control the water requirements a little bit more than in field crops if you're irrigating. But water is a big concern. Like I said before, the biggest drawback is mold. And you can destroy a whole bunch of feed with mold quite quickly and actually lose your day's production if you produce a lot of mold. And we have done that before here in our research, and it is not good to get a lot of mold. You certainly don't want to feed that to animals. If you can grow mold in your fodder production, you don't want to be feeding that to the animals, because you could get animals that are sick, or they could end up dying depending on what sort of mold is produced. One of the drawbacks, I think we need to talk about the cost in terms of either kilograms or pounds of dry matter. Most people talk about it that you can produce fodder cheap. Well, that's on an as-fed basis. But if you actually convert it to a dry matter basis, the cost might not be there. And we'll talk about that later on. There's lots of labor requirements that are a concern. We talk about initial capital expenses. These systems are maybe, they're not cheap if you want to produce a lot of forage for a lot of cows or sheep or goats. And from an organic standpoint, certainly doesn't qualify for organic pasture rule or some grass-fed labels. So see, some of the basics that we've sort of figured out when you think about producing fodder are, what is your source of grain? A lot of people have gone into barley, some wheat, oats, sunflower, peas. There's others out there. I'll show you some research that we did. A lot of people are using barley fodder. I wasn't certainly sold on barley when all of this started. It's like, well, why can't we use other grains? Barley is not the easiest grain to come by. In the upper Midwest, there's way more oats or other grains than barley. What about the feed grade of, obviously you want to use feed grade grain with high test weight and no mold. You don't, that's really where the mold starts, is really in the seed. So if you can have clean seed, you might be able to produce fodder without mold. Obviously you have to wash the seed before soaking, possibly to get some of the dirt off, to make it clean. That's probably the thing. If you are going to grow fodder, you need really clean seed. And usually you have to soak the grains, maybe 12, 24 hours in, warm water to get it to sort of sprout beforehand. And we soaked it for about 24 hours before we seeded it. You need to have a clean system. So all of the trays need to be cleaned. Molds can be a problem if you don't go into a clean tray. I talked about clean seed, but you also need to have a clean system. So there's you might use bleach, vinegar, hydrogen peroxide, you name it, to get these systems clean. That's probably the number one thing that I've reiterated to producers that want to try this: clean seed and a clean system. And you'll probably reduce your chances of growing mold. You might still grow mold, but it will certainly reduce it. And one is maintaining a temperature, 65, 70 degrees, humidity 50 to 60% to grow that. So moderating temperature in rooms can be really difficult. So you also have to determine the production capacity. How much feed do you want to produce a day? If my example here is a cow, dairy cow, 3 to 4% of their body weight. We want to produce about 30 pounds per head per day, and that's as fed. So producing 30 pounds of fresh forage per day. And if you think about this 30 pounds at 20% dry matter, that's about 6 pounds of dry matter per day, which is not a lot to include in a ration. So one question that I get from farms is, can we feed this solely to animals and they'll get their nutritional requirements? And the answer is no. You simply cannot produce enough forage from fodder to supply the animals' needs. You need other things to feed, whether that's hay or silage, because if you think about on a dry matter basis, it simply does not produce enough dry matter per animal to get their nutritional requirements. So you need to figure out, what the size of your animal is, whether it's a cow, a horse, a sheep, goat. Their requirements will be a lot different from a dry matter perspective. And feeding option, but this fodder is very valuable. It's expensive to produce. It's depending on how you feed it, you don't want to waste it. So whether you feed it on the ground, you can see some of the pictures that I have. You simply don't want to waste it because it is very valuable and expensive to produce. So you can see some other different fodder systems. Some of the ideas I will get obviously are based on a dairy cow basis today, but you can think about this if you want to feed it to pigs, to horses, to sheep, chickens. A lot of people feed it to smaller ruminants, goats as well, or dairy cows, beef cows, you name it. There's a lot of people thinking about feeding it to many different livestock species. I was at we went on a University of Minnesota dairy extension tour. It's been quite a few years, to a dairy in Wisconsin that was 500-600 cows, organic herd that was sprouting fodder in their production facility. And this was their soaking mechanism that they used from a barley standpoint to soak it every day. So you'd turn it and soak all this barley seed. This was their fodder production facility. So you can see, I believe is a farm tech system that they use so they could grow lots of forage for 600 milking cows every single day. And I think they had 2 people in there, and that's all they were doing was harvesting forage, soaking seed, reseeding the trays, cleaning everything. So there was a big labor requirement in this facility. Now, these are our cows at Morris. So we fed it as well. This was probably one of the first few days that I produced fodder. So I just kind of threw it in front of the cows just to see if they would eat it and what would happen. And obviously they'll eat the green fresh fresh forage. This is not how we ended up feeding it to our cows in the when we did some studies. We actually mixed it in the TMR, but this is, you know, just kind of an idea of what happens if they want to eat it. So these were kind of a couple examples. You know, I think Cindy Daly in California also did some stuff with fodder production systems. This is kind of an example from that. Is the seeds are different. You have to think about it, what seed source you want. Like I said before, some seeds you could have different dry matters, different protein levels. You know, they're different NDFs, different, you know, NELs, TDNs. There's just differences in seed sources. And this is as a grain, you know, so you have to take that into consideration. What is the value of that grain as well? Now, when you actually produce this is from Cindy when she grew fodder quite a few years ago. You'll notice that for the quality of the barley fodder changes across time. So these are the first 5 days after growth. You can see dry matter changes a lot. Crude protein kind of goes up as you increase fodder. NDF goes up. NEL goes down. So you know, there is a big difference in day to day in fodder production. So you kind of have to be able to dial that in and know what you're getting. You know, the dry matter goes down quite a bit as the time goes on. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the research that we did here in Minnesota, where I had a farm tech fodder system that I utilized. And like I said before, I didn't necessarily believe that barley was the #1 grain source that we could use. So we wanted to test some of these other grains out, whether it was barley, oats, rye, triticale, and wheat. So we tested all of them. That was part of our project first, was to determine the best grain to use. So this is our fodder production system. This is some oats in some trays here growing. You can see here in rye, you know, it starts to sprout after a couple days. You can maybe see a little bit of mold growing in there already. But after a while, you get some nice fodder production, really. If you can sprout it, you water it. You know, this is a daily task. It is time consuming and labor requirements to water it a few times a day and making sure it all works. And you know, we did well. We got fodder production out of our grains. You can see, so we embarked on this study and weighed every single tray that we got to determine what we actually produced from a fodder standpoint and how much dry matter we could produce. Well, like I said before, we could also produce mold. This is rye, and it produced mold. And you can see on the right that it, you know, if I would say that the rye seed was not as clean as what some of the other seed sources were. So we could produce a lot of mold, and we just, you don't want to feed that to the animals because you just don't know what's going to happen to them. But mold is a big consideration, and we could produce it. So like I said, we tested these different grains. We loaded up our fodder system, harvested them 7 days after growth, did this a few times, and just wanted to see what the forage quality was, minerals, and mold. So this was average dry matter across these different species of grains. You know, barley was the lowest amount of dry matter, which is kind of in tune to what we think. Triticale, rye, oats were much higher. Wheat, about the same. And then we sort of developed some sort of mold score. Well, you can see the rye and the triticale didn't do very good for mold. We could produce a lot of mold in those. And I think that goes back to not having very clean seed from the rye and the triticale. And I bought this seed. This was not farm seed. This, you know, I bought this out of from a seed company. And so maybe the seed wasn't quite as clean compared to barley and oats. Wheat a little bit too, but the rye and the triticale really produced a lot of mold, severe mold in a lot of trays. If you look at the forage quality, there's kind of a lot of differences between these grain species. You know, if barley on the left there is about 16% protein, oats and rye are a little bit less, wheat and triticale much higher from a protein standpoint. NDF, oats and barley had the highest NDF. Rye, triticale, and wheat was lower. So maybe better forage quality in barley and oats. If you look at starch, so we reduced some of the starch levels, you know, from a grain to a fodder. But overall, you know, there's differences in forage quality, but it certainly depends on what you want to feed and how well you can produce mold is the question. This was sort of a comparison that we did if you think about it from a grain perspective and a barley fodder perspective. So you just increase the protein a little bit, you know, barley grain 14%. We increase the NDF, decrease the carbohydrates in the fodder compared to the grain. NEL was the same, TDN was the same, maybe increase the calcium a little bit by growing the fodder, but overall, there isn't a lot of difference. You increase the NDF in fodder compared to the grain, but the grain is pretty good too, from a feeding standpoint. You know, there was some differences in minerals. I'm not going to go across a lot of this, but barley maybe had a little bit higher calcium. Some of the other minerals were pretty much the same across all of the grain, across all of the grain species when we grew them for fodder. So not much difference in really differences in grain from a mineral standpoint. They all kind of produced about the same. So what did we learn from our grain study? Basically, barley and oats had the most forage mass. Triticale was the lowest. So we could produce a lot of forage and fodder with barley. The barley had the highest forage quality. So you might consider that. So, you know, I sort of disproved my thought that maybe there was other grains out there. Barley probably is the best, but oats might be another option. You know, there's maybe a few more oats up here in the upper Midwest than there is barley. So oats might be a good idea as well. And I don't know if this will show or not, but I have a video here. So this is this is our cows eating the fodder, and they're just going to town on it. So that sort of, they sort of like eating it and do well. That sort of led us into a cow study. So we wanted to use the best grain. And so we did a study here with, we had 36 cows at our research facility where we mixed this in with a TMR. So we had a TMR with no fodder, and there was 8 pounds of grain in there. And then we used 20 pounds of fodder as fed. So just a couple pounds of dry matter. And that's, you know, we just couldn't get the fodder production that a lot of people claim that they could get. And I tried everything. I did more experimentation to try and, you know, temperature, humidity, water. I tried grow lights, you name it. And I simply could not get the production that other people were sort of claiming. And so that's about what we got. And that's what we fed. This is our production facility that we use. So you can see it's in banks of 7. So every day we harvest the fodder for these 18 cows. You know, after a couple days, you get some production. And you can see how well it grows. And some of the trays where it's maybe they don't get as much light, it doesn't grow as well. But as you go on, you sort of have on a daily basis, you water and harvest and seed, and you can see the grow lights in the background. And trying to get more fodder production. So we produced, you know, barley fodder and could get that production out of there. So these are the cows that we had. So we had 18 cows in our herd. And so these are sort of the results. We did this for about 3 months. We fed fodder and produced for these cows. So this is the production that we got. And these were sort of mid to late lactation cows that we used. So we get, 30 pounds of milk for these cows, later lactation cows. Fat, no difference. Fat percentage, maybe, if you want to claim the fat and protein percentages were a little bit higher with fodder, but not statistically different. On a pound basis, no difference in production, somatic cell count, somatic cell score, no difference. And MUNs, you see it increased MUNs in fodder, the cows that were fed fodder, because you supply more fresh grass. It's like adding pasture to the ration. You're going to see the MUNs go up. We looked at activity and rumination. So we had some collars on these cows, and basically, rumination went down in the cows that were fed fodder. Not necessarily sure why. Probably had to do with the fresh forage that was fed, but really nothing to write home about. If you look at it, these cows, had similar rumination across time, but nothing really to write home about. One thing that was interested, so we sampled the fatty acid profiles of the milk from these cows, and didn't really find much difference for a lot of the different fatty acids. CLAs was the same. Everybody thinks about CLAs. CLAs was the same from a fodder versus no fodder standpoint. You can see some of the other ones. There was maybe an increase in omega-3 fatty acids in fodder production. That's because there was more fresh fodder in there. So you maybe lowered the omega-6 to 3 ratio because you increased green grass and fodder in there. So what about economics? So we did some economics. This is dry matter intake on those cows. You could say, well, we increased dry matter intake on the no fodder cows. Dry matter intake per milk production was less with the fodder cows. Really, I was thinking more from an economic standpoint. We did this with some organic farms, looking at higher grain prices. That was sort of the idea back then, was, can smaller organic farms make this work? And I looked at different corn prices at the time that we did this study, and really at a really astronomically high organic corn price of $17 a bushel, maybe you can gain some economic advantage to feeding fodder. But organic corn hasn't been that high in a long time, so it's probably not advantageous. Even if you think about $12 corn, there's no economic advantage to feed fodder compared to no fodder. This was an example farm economics. Kathy kind of put together. If you think about it, you have some seed, you have the nutrients you get, maybe there's some energy, obviously you have lights, there's labor, can be expensive. The barley seed can be expensive as well, so you have about $100 cost on a ton per ton as fed, which is about 5 cents a pound on an as fed basis. If you think about the dry matter perspective, that's where it really drives it home a little bit, is the cost per pound of dry matter is about 42 cents. And I think Larry Tranel did some research a long time ago and has a fact sheet as well that kind of came up with the same results, about 40 to 50 cents per pound of dry matter on his spreadsheet. If you think about that in a cost per ton, it's about $830 per ton for dry matter. So, and this really doesn't necessarily include the capital investment, which is upfront. So $830 a ton dry matter is really expensive feed. And I certainly couldn't recommend any farm purchase $800 a ton hay or forage. It just wouldn't work for the farm. So if you think about some of the economics, a lot of places often state that fodder can be produced for $60 to $200 a ton. Sure, it can on an as-fed basis, but we have to think about it on a dry matter basis. What are we feeding? You know, like I said before, that 20 pounds of dry matter is only a couple pounds, or sorry, 20 pounds as fed is only 2 to 3 pounds dry matter. So we need to think about it on a dry matter basis. We think about that with all of our other rations, whether it's corn silage, haylage, you know, all of our TMR rations that we put together, it's always on a dry matter basis. So we have to think about fodder on a dry matter basis as well. And how many other feeds do we purchase or balance the ration? You know, like I said, this will not supply 100% of the ration. So you need to think about other feeds that are going into this and how you balance the ration with the fodder on an as-fed basis. Like I said, if you convert it to dry matter, you can get $3,000 to $1,000 a ton of dry matter. Like I said, so here's Larry's numbers. We had about 18 cents per kilogram of dry matter in his economic analysis. That's about $800 a ton. That's really expensive. I've never paid $800 a ton for hay here at our research center. So, you know, 5 cents a kilogram of dry matter is about $200 a ton. So it's really, fodder can be very expensive when you think about it on a dry matter basis. So how does it compare to other forages? And that's the question you need to ask, is how does it compare to other forages that can be delivered to the farm? You know, what is the guaranteed analysis? And obviously you have to think about labor as well. So just one slide on labor. It varies greatly between systems. I did some of this work. I was harvesting you know, Saturdays and Sundays were my days to harvest fodder. So I was harvesting and seeding and all that stuff. And it is a lot of work. It took for producing fodder for 20 cows, it probably took me 3 hours, 2 to 3 hours every day for harvesting, cleaning, reseeding, re-soaking seed. It just takes a lot of time and a lot of labor. And most farmers don't put a value on labor in their fodder systems. So it can really be cost prohibitive if you have to hire somebody to be able to do all of this production. So where may fodder fit in a production system? Well, if you want to become self-sufficient in feed production, it may help out. If you have some chickens or some other small animals, it might work. Certainly might not work for lots of cattle. If you have high land prices, you're landlocked, maybe that might fit in. Arid regions where it's a little bit drier. What if you don't have sources for high quality forage? Well, maybe that might fit in as well. If you can't get good forage, or if you end up trucking forage across the country, it might not work out. But you need to be able to avoid mold. Mold is the problem. Like I said, it might work for small herds, 1 or 2 cows, maybe some rabbits, poultry, things like that. If you have high grain prices, low availability, that especially in an organic system, but like I said, the organic grain price has to be really high to maybe make this work. But really, so in the end, you have to, put the pencil to the paper, evaluate all your options, what the costs are, what your farm goals are, to see if it will actually work. So kind of in summary, so it's not necessarily a cheap or easy alternative to produce high quality forage. You have mold, there's downtime, which can be less production. This is not a silver bullet to solve issues. It can be a huge learning curve. I found that out. I was not necessarily ready. with all of the labor that went into it, how to do it, how to get high quality forage. It's a lot. It's a lot. And there's lots of labor, high maintenance. Like I said, it may have application in small farms, high land prices, but you need to evaluate the forage sources that you can get on your farm to see what might happen, to see if actually fodder is worthwhile. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you have or comments about growing fodder and what we found in our production system. So thanks for joining today.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Dr. Heins. It looks like we've got a couple of questions coming in. First question, at a fodder company's display at a trade show in California last year, there was a claim that there was potential decrease in methane. Have you seen any of this demonstrated?
I have not. I have heard that some places maybe have decreased methane, but I haven't seen any research or anything that have shown any sort of decrease in methane by feeding fodder. I don't know.
Okay, I know we've got some other industry people. Is anyone out there had this demonstrated to them? I mean, go ahead and unmute and tell us. Otherwise, I'll go into some of the other questions that have come in. As you were looking at seeds, did you test any legumes out there?
We did not test any legumes for seed. You know, there was, I thought about alfalfa at one time because some farms were sprouting alfalfa, but I mostly did the grain seeds because this is what, you know, was some of the farms were actually looking at. So, but alfalfa, I thought about it, but wasn't quite sure on how much fodder alfalfa sprouts could produce.
Okay. Were there any significant differences in best practices between growing barley or oats?
No, not really. You know, most of it, I think if you get good seed, high quality seed, you can grow good fodder with oats as well. We didn't change any, you know, we did the same thing for all of the grain species that we did. So really it comes back to the seed source to being able to grow high quality forage.
Okay. Gail, you asked about the methane comparison compared to relative to what? You want to just unmute and kind of ask that question?
Yeah, I guess that question would be for Philip or Dr. Jordan with the company that was making some claims at the trade show you were talking about. To me, it's kind of meaningless to say you'd reduce methane, right? Like you have to be reducing it compared to something. So I guess I don't know, Philip, if you even remember what it was. But I was curious about that.
I do know their method for testing was a gun that they pointed at the cow's mouth, so it wasn't a green box.
Mm-hmm.
So I question a little bit their method there, whether that was very accurate or not. And then it was the cows on the fodder versus those that weren't on the fodder, they said was lower. I just wonder if there's any other more rigorous scientific studies on that where the cows are in boxes inside very controlled environment.
Yeah, this is Jim Selfer. I'll just ask Gail and Philip. My understanding is that higher forage diets, and I think you've done some of this work, Brad, higher forage, higher fiber diets are higher in methane. So I think if you're comparing it to feeding a real high forage diet, 100% forage, it's lower in probably NDF than a high forage diet than a comparable forage. But I think, Gail, you make a good point. What are you comparing it to?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that was my thought as well, Jim. If you're, it might be apples and oranges what the comparison they're actually making is.
Yeah.
Well, right, and you're going to get differences in methane based on, you know, daily forage
Right.
production, whether what's ever in the feed. And, you know, I have a green feed and I've seen that cows on pasture. It can be quite wild depending on when they do it. Actually, if you think about methane, you know, it's lower in the morning than it is in the evening too. So it all depends on when you want to measure it and relative to the time of feeding.
Hmm.
Okay, Dr. Heins, we've got a question regarding the procedure. Were you able to maintain the target temperature and humidity? And if you did you still have mold problems?
Yes, we were able to maintain temperature in it, and humidity. The problem I think that we faced was probably light, and being able to, whether it was sunlight or natural light, was probably the biggest factor in growing. You know, ours was in an enclosed building, so you know, I think that was probably the bigger thing, is being able to have light. You know, that helps grow fodder, whether you have the temperature or not. So we were able to maintain it. It took a lot of work and to be able to dial in the temperature, but yes, we could pretty much maintain what we wanted to.
We've got a couple questions very similar. Did you use bleach when washing and soaking seed to minimize mold potential? And then once you had the outbreak, how did you clean up and prepare the facility for the next round?
So yes, we did use a little bit of bleach in each of every time we soaked the seeds to possibly help with mold growth. Every day that we harvested feed with the trays, we you know, sprayed them down, cleaned them, and sprayed them with bleach to try and get any sort of remnants of mold off of them. We really tried to do our best to minimize mold and get everything clean. I think when we were producing fodder for the cow study, we didn't have a lot of mold. We had some, but not a lot. I would say that the seed source and the dirty seed was probably a bigger contributor to the mold problem, like what we saw in the rye and the triticale, than it was the system.
Okay, we'll stick on the mold for right now. Did you see any seasonality to your mold issues?
No, not really. We did, you know, this study during the summertime and into the fall. So not really. As long, you know, we were inside a building where we could control the temperature and the humidity. So I think as long as we kept that constant, you know, we sort of minimized the impact to any weather problems.
Okay, now a couple of light questions. Do the grow lights help all the trays? Seems like some would be in the shade made by the trays above them. And then what did you use for lights, and where they run over each tray or just ceiling?
We just, you know, went down to the local hardware store and got some grow lights and tried to put them up in places where we felt that needed some extra light for growth. We had some above, you know, we replaced the fluorescent bulbs in the facility with grow lights, and we tried to put them, I think, you know, there were windows in this facility, and I found that the sunlight that could get in from the windows onto the fodder system, probably it grew better than what it was from the grow lights. You know, you can't beat sunlight to grow things. So the more sunlight, the better off we were in fodder production if it could get through the windows.
Okay, now have a question here to talk about animal health and condition. Did you find any body condition decreases with fodder fed cows relative to non-fodder fed?
We did not. We didn't find any difference in body condition or body weight or any of those sort of parameters at all. No.
Any other health issues crop up?
Nope, no health issues. Nope, Not at all. Not at all.
Okay, did you see or would you be able to glean from the data this could work maybe better for feeding, transitioning calves versus the milking herd?
Well, I didn't put it in here, but I actually did a heifer study as well the next year to see if we could replace grain in feeding heifers on pasture. And we fed probably 25 heifers that were fed fodder and 25 that were fed grain. And we didn't find any difference whatsoever in feeding heifers. So as far as growth rates or intake, anything like that. So, I think it all comes down to economics and what the cost of fodder production is, whether you should feed it to your animals, whether it's a heifer or a cow or anything. So, and I simply don't think even from a heifer standpoint, it would make economic sense.
Okay, kind of back to the growing of the fodder. What would be the issue growing in a greenhouse, i.e. heated tunnels, 5 mils, just going off your sunlight comment?
You might get better growth, I think, from a sunlight perspective. I actually thought about putting it in a greenhouse at the time. We were in kind of an enclosed barn, but after the fact, I thought, well, maybe if I put it in a greenhouse where the sunlight was able to, be on the fodder a lot more, I probably would have seen more growth. I don't know that for sure, but that would be my guess, is that I could have gotten more growth with better sunlight.
Okay. Do you see any automation for fodder production coming online? Is there research out there or people developing it to help cut the labor issue?
Well, that was sort of one of my ideas back when we finished the study. I was doing some of this myself and students, and that was the big thing, is if you could automate this, it might alleviate some of the labor requirements and make it easier to produce. At the time, there was maybe some companies that had some automation, but not a lot. But if you could automate it, it might provide some benefits. But I still am not sure. Once you think about it economically on a dry matter basis, I'm not sure that automation could overcome that effect.
Okay. We have Larry Tranel on the program with us. Larry, would you like to maybe share some other insights we didn't get covered from the papers you put together?
Bottom line, I guess I would just say that I agree with everything Brad says. I think his analysis actually came up, and I didn't have the privilege of actually feeding my stuff to dairy cows, but I just was listening to several different presentations, reading a lot of the research. So I just started putting the numbers together, and kind of coincidentally, they come up almost exactly the way Brad mentions. The one thing about the investment costs on top of that, I mean, just if just the variable costs are that high, just think of what people are spending on these systems and how much more that investment cost would work with this. And so to have forage that's going to cost you over $1,000 a ton would not be out of the ordinary for this kind of a system to work with. So I just definitely appreciate actually the thought process of actually being able to take the research through the dairy cows, because like I said, mine was just putting numbers together through the spreadsheet based on testimonials that farmers that are using the systems would actually have been given me. And this, I guess the sad part about some of these is just, I mean, I've seen this system actually take down several farms. And just if they didn't lose their farm over it, they came pretty darn close to it. And I think that's the sad thing, that just the economics of this is pretty important for us to understand and try to relay to producers as they try to work with it. Because I think from the top part of it, it does sound good from the get-go, just how, all the benefits from it. I mean, it sounds pretty enticing, which got me to look at it actually at the onset of too. And so I just appreciate the webinar here today.
Thank you, Larry. For the folks attending, if you look at the chat box, We do a evaluation for all of our webinars. If you would please click on that and answer. It's very short, 4 questions. We'd sure appreciate it. Helps us do a better job. And then the program will be archived at our I-29 Moo University website, and that link is there also. Give us about a week is what it takes for us to get that processed and put up there on the website. Dr. Heins, any last closing comments?
I think, you really got to think about fodder production and look at the costs and whether you can produce enough to make it work. I think it's all going to come down to economics.
Very good. Well, we thank the folks who attended the program for us and thank Brad for putting it together and sharing this information. We thank you, and we will look forward to the audience coming back next month for the I-29 Moo University Dairy webinar. Thank you now.